we've got four of us talking today, which is quite unusual to have any trans people talking about trans rights, particularly in the UK. Just to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Natasha Kennedy. I work at Goldsmiths University in London. I've a lot of experience living abroad in Europe. I've lived, worked, studied in Norway, Denmark, Greece, France and Germany. I'm a sociologist. I've just finished a PhD at UCL about young trans people and coming out, and I'm now co-chair of a big, massive new international feminist and gender studies network called FGen, which is intersectional, feminist and inclusive and opposed to transphobia. And we're hoping to have a big conference for that in London coming up in April, COVID willing. Anyway, I'm going to start off just to introduce the situation of trans rights, being trans in Europe. Now, you've probably all noticed that in the UK there's a lot of exclusion in the media, from the media of trans people. Trans Media Watch reckons that 95% of media coverage about trans people is hostile. Last year, The Times published 324 articles about trans people, none of which were written by trans people. So most other media is pretty much similar as well, and there's some quite extreme selection bias in that as well. So when the initial Keira Bell case against the Tavistock was won by the opposition, that was widely reported. What was not widely reported was the appeal earlier this year, which completely crushed it. Again, Stonewall, the media has reported on accusations that its advice about the Equalities Act was wrong, and actually Stonewall's advice about the Equalities Act was completely correct, and that's supported by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which is no friends to trans people, and it was also endorsed by the High Court. Yet the media has not reported on that. And I think one of the most important things a lot of people might have picked up in the UK was when Professor Judith Butler, who is one of the world's most well-known academics, was censored by The Guardian back in September. Literally a chunk of her interview was cut out, and it caused an awful lot of problems. And actually this is where I ran into Tamsin Omond. We have had a few demonstrations outside the Guardian offices about that. There are a huge number of anti-trans hate groups popping up all over the country, and one of the things that Judith Butler was censored for, I think, by the Guardian, was saying that these groups are linked to fascism, to the far right, and that includes the gender critical transphobes as well. There's a lot of opaque funding from these groups. There's some evidence that this funding has come from the far right in the US and Russia, but they are also linked to anti-gender campaigns in Europe. And this includes homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic, anti-refugee campaigns in Europe, particularly things like anti-abortion and opposition to protection against domestic violence, for example. And again, these are widely known to be supported by the far right, and in some cases by the Vatican as well. Poland, Hungary, Russia, other parts of Eastern Europe. as well as parts of the United States, you know, like Texas, Mississippi, Tennessee. And as we all know, people like Trump, Bolsonaro, Putin, Orban, Erdogan are very much opposed to trans rights, as well as things like abortion. As we see in America, Roe v. Wade is now under threat. It's under threat by the same people who are threatening trans rights, who are threatening to withdraw equal marriage and things like that. And this is kind of Europe-wide at the moment. There's a very important book to read, actually, Anti-Gender Campaigns in Europe. And it's actually spreading to places like South America. And people like Lola Olufemi, Alison Phipps, Judith Butler are pointing the finger now at gender critical transphobic groups as enabling this. Jules Gill-Peterson actually provided some evidence that the talking points, the arguments being used by these groups are being recycled, but deniably, into right-wing anti-trans groups, into actually right-wing anti-trans legislation in places like Texas. In actual fact, a lot of the right-wing material that has been going around in these anti-gender campaigns for 10 or 15 years now in Europe is now being recycled also into these gender critical groups as well. Terms like gender ideology, a good an alternative to saying trans people. They don't want to call us people. So the anti-trans feminist groups are being called out for being transphobic, racist, classist. And although we have some pretty nasty situations in places like Poland and Hungary, at least people in those countries, and I've talked to some trans people in those countries, at least they have the option of immigrating, of going to other countries within the EU, which is not particularly easy for us at the moment. What is encouraging, however, is that there is now starting to build quite a good inclusionary intersectional feminist movement in places like Poland, other parts of Eastern Europe, and also indeed in South America as well, which is very inclusionary. It's very pro-trans, it's anti-homophobic, and it's actually starting to work together to oppose some of these this right-wing action, which I think is very, very necessary, because like I've said, the same people who are trying to take away my rights are the same people who are trying to take away people's rights to bodily autonomy, like abortion and protection from domestic violence and things like that. So that's kind of what I'm talking about as the way forward. So that's the scene being set, if you like. The transphobia in the UK is very much part of a wider right-wing push against any kind of diversity, really, against not just trans people, but lesbian, gay and bisexual people, and against women, and also against refugees and people like that. And yes, it's the sex education debates, for example, them trying to prevent there being inclusive sex education in schools is also part of this as well. So there's a lot of this is combined, is working together, and I think it's important that we, as a movement, work with people like this. We work intersectionally, we work across different groups. So I'm going to stop there because I can talk too much, as many people know. I'm going to introduce Tamsin Omond, now. Since dropping banners against Heathrow Airport's third runway from the roof of the Houses of Parliament, Tamsin has consistently shifted public conversation on climate and ecological emergency. They have organised and been arrested for a number of high-profile protests, co-founded a suffragette-inspired environmental group called Climate Rush, coordinated the successful Save England's Forests Coalition, founded a CIC, the Momentum Project, that mobilises the community surrounding London City Airport, led global corporate campaigns as head of global campaigns at Lush Cosmetics, and been a founding member of Extinction Rebellion. In 2021, Tamsin stood for the co-leadership of the Green Party of England and Wales. They are also active in Queer Uprising. They are a theatre maker and author of Rush, the making of a climate activist, and of Do Earth, Healing Strategies for Humankind. Their pronouns are they, them. I'll hand over to Tamsin.
Natasha, thank you so much for that kind of broader context of where we are with trans rights in the UK and the attacks on trans rights, where that's coming from. And I just want to pause for a moment, and I guess I was like, it was affecting to hear Natasha talk about the possibility of trans people in Europe to move countries, and how that is no longer such an easy option for trans people in the UK. And just to kind of pause for a moment on the fact that we are living in the UK in a culture that is so hostile to trans people, that the desire to leave is a commonly held one within the trans community. We've been singled out recently in a report for baseless and concerning anti-trans rhetoric. And it's a report about rising hate against LGBT plus people in Europe that was published by the Council of Europe, I think earlier this year. And I guess within that kind of broader context that Natasha gave us, I'm just going to spend like some moments talking about my experience as a trans person in the UK. And I guess I just want to say that like this isn't what I do. Like I'm not, you know, to be trans right now, we all have to be activists. And that's just an exhausting fact of being a trans person, that we don't get to, you know, that our identities in some ways are political. But talking about my experience as a trans person isn't something that I feel fluid in the same way that I would if I were here talking as a climate activist. So just to invite some, yeah, some recognition of that fact, that this isn't easy, and that I imagine that it's not easy for trans people generally to talk to a widely cis audience about our experience of being trans. So I am, yeah, as my introduction said, I'm an environmental activist. I've done a lot in terms of uplifting the climate emergency through various tactics within the UK over the past 10, etc. years. And I guess my impulse for doing that was the recognition that climate breakdown would lead and is indeed leading to the scapegoating of communities, of marginalized communities. And we've heard about how that has been or is being played out through the creation and legitimization and like even the kind of popularization, if you read the Daily Mail, of border policies that kill in the UK. And this right-wing agenda, this feeding of fear and division within narratives within the media and narratives within the very top levels of our political establishment, and how those filter down to, you know, what is generally thought in our society, the culture that we all have to live within. That same energy that is fueling the acceptance of those border policies is the same energy that's fueling transphobia in the UK and everywhere else. So my activism has always focused on climate, and there's only been 2 times that I've been involved in organising kind of queer protests, and the first of those was with Peter Tatchell, who is kind of problematic actually in some ways, in how he as a cis man is talking about trans people, but he's been a great queer activist. And the first I organised with him within the kind of queer bracket was a protest must have been 2010, inviting David Cameron to come out and let us know what he thought about gay rights and gay marriage. And then, you know, 10 years passed and I was just doing climate activism, and I guess in some ways the culture changed. I also came out as a trans person, and the most recent, the only other time that I've organised a kind of LGBTQIA+ protest was alongside Natasha earlier this year. As she mentioned, I would just like to uplift her as core to the movement for trans rights in the UK, a core organiser and an organiser who recognises the importance and power of protest. She has been kind of single-handedly holding the left-wing media to account on their promotion of transphobic narratives, especially The Guardian and The Observer, as she mentioned, with the Judith Butler censoring, and a whole swathe of other lazily transphobic articles that were just being pushed out kind of week on week because of transphobes in the editorial teams at those newspapers. So that protest was earlier this year, and we stood outside The Guardian and asked them to stop publishing the transphobia. So I guess in some ways it's like what woke me up to the fact that that my rights were being infringed, that standing up for trans rights was something that I might want to do, and I guess surprisingly for me, and I think, you know, we all on the left have to really be strong, like to strongly critique our circles as not having all of the answers, and also having transphobia kind of endemic in the culture of our circles. Because for me, it was really shocking to discover that the environmental movement, some of the leading voices within the environmental movement were platforming transphobia, and that included, you know, I've worked at various levels within the environmental movement. I know the movers and shakers, I know the people who get to allocate funding, I know the people who get to make the films, and there were 2 people who I'd worked with extensively throughout my kind of environmentalist career whose Facebooks were just plastered with transphobia. I'm not going to name names because it's not a very useful thing to do, but I guess for me it was this recognition that these places that I felt were safe, you know, environmental organising always felt like a safe place for me. I thought that there was a level of intersectionalism that was kind of like defended. I found that wasn't true. And so at that point, I was working in Extinction Rebellion. I was kind of core to like the early years of that movement. And we made a statement, which I'll just read, because actually, like, in some ways, I think a useful thing that can happen is that organizations that don't have kind of trans inclusion in their DNA can come out strong, like can allow trans people within those movements to write really strong statements, and then they can use all of their platform to uplift those statements. And that was the process whereby Extinction Rebellion came out for trans rights, and you know, this statement was written by a group of us who were within Extinction Rebellion, and who felt that the space that we were organizing within was you know, was in danger of being lost to that gender critical section of the environmentalist kind of group. So it says this: "We state loudly and clearly, trans liberation is intrinsic and inseparable from the liberation of all humanity. Trans comrades are at the front and center of our struggles, and long may they remain so. Ultimately, transphobic rhetoric legitimizes both structural and personal violence against trans people. Trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary and all other gender expressions which do not conform to the gender that person is assigned at birth are valid, legitimate and true. This is not up for debate. We do not believe that the existence of trans people or the clearly documented oppression and abuse they experience is a topic that should be up for debate. Extinction Rebellion offers our unconditional support and solidarity to all trans people in the face of unrelenting attacks from trans exclusionary radical feminists, the media, elected politicians, and even from leading voices within the environmental movement." So we published that, and it became kind of known that I was in some ways around behind the organizing of that statement. And what happened then was backlash from a whole bunch of women in the Green Party who had known me before my transition, and who felt betrayed by my organizing for trans rights. And that was, again, a kind of a surprise. I guess this is the thing with privilege, is that when you don't recognize that you have it until bits of it are taken away, or it's difficult to see that you have it until bits of it are taken away. And so I had this kind of relentless attack on all of my various social media channels from a bunch of gender critical or TERFs within the Green Party, and that led me to take a great big step backwards from the Green Party. The kinds of questions they were asking me are violent, and I'm not going to repeat them on a call. I'm not going to repeat them here because they don't bear talking about. Yes. So then what happened is, I stepped back from the Green Party, and then recently, the Green Party leadership, there was a contest in the Green Party leadership where the leader of the Green Party stepped down because she recognized that she hadn't done enough to stop the growth of transphobia in the Green Party. And at that point, I spoke to the deputy leader of the Green Party, who is an ally, and we decided to stand together on a platform of liberation, and of, acknowledging how far there is to go and how much work we all have to do in de-binarying and transphobering our minds, and to try and begin to do that work. And that experience, I'd just like to say that this isn't a problem that is unique to the Green Party. It really is a problem that is everywhere in the UK at the moment, and is only being propelled further by the transphobic narratives in media and political culture. And so
we move on in a minute, Tamsin. Yeah,
definitely. So I just say it was kind of hard, and it was variously tricky, because that culture was there, and because actually undoing it is going to take all of us organizing for it to be undone. It's not something we can just close our eyes to or hope will get better, because actually, like, the strength of these narratives and the strength of the right-wing agenda is to keep pushing this, and to keep you know, pushing trans people into a corner and pointing at us and calling us names, etc., etc. So I guess apologism isn't the answer. Like, we do have to center trans people in finding these solutions, and we need to look after them as we center them. And I guess it's not, I'll just finish on this, like, it's not only because you know, it's not only because it's right, and that we don't, you know, that we're divided only when we don't stand up for people. That's when we're divided, not when we stand up for people. But it's also because we have a lot to learn from communities who have been marginalized. People who have been rejected by the status quo find so many creative ways to heal the trauma of not belonging. You know, we create countercultures with ambitions that go beyond society's model of success. And, you know, instead of prioritizing individualistic success, we develop rich networks of support, we develop connection, we develop friendship, we develop chosen families. And so I guess I would just say that trans people in some ways are pathfinders to a new world. Like, we have survived impossible conditions, and as this planet becomes more difficult to survive on, we would do well to center the voices and center the experiences of those whose very beings in some ways have rejected the practice of domination. I will pass back to you, Natasha.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I would add really that what Tamsin has been saying about the Green Party goes also for the Labour Party, indeed the left of the Labour Party. I actually resigned from Momentum because of Momentum's support for anti-trans candidates for the NEC, and as did quite a lot of trans people. So it's not just the Green Party as well. Okay, I'm going to move on. Our next speaker is Biche de Ville, a punk poet from Belgium. They write out loud what you live down. They sing the ills of those who do not, explode the boxes and codes to take their place, between French pop and electro dance, between slam and rap, between 80s and 90s, between awareness and position. Biche gently points their finger at the flaws of our current society, and their pronouns are they, them. Over to you.
Oh, do you hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
I just say thank you. And please be kind, because my English is not perfect. Then I will help me with some notes. And then, yeah, I'm punk poet. I sing committed poetry on electronic music. And with my poetry, I try to denounce the flaws of our current society. I deal with themes like racism, feminism, and the notion of consent, ecology, gender issues. I try to make people dance while raising their awareness. I think that music is a soft method to convey strong messages. Dancing to electronic music frees the body, and when the lyrics make people think, it frees them to speak. You can then tackle serious issues with more ease. And I am transgender and non-binary. I came in and out only a year ago. And I started my physical transition in February. And yes, I choose to talk about it in my music through my first album, I don't know, see, Kevin. and it's me when I was 7, and it's the name I choose for myself when I was 7 years old. And at that time, I had asked my mom to have a bowl cut and to wear a blue sweatshirt with a yellow cowboy on it. It was an anecdote I used to tell at gigs, but it makes sense this year. I am who I am today from the beginning. My first album and my concerts tell the whole story of my journey up to now. I also decided to talk about it on the networks and during radio and TV interviews. It wasn't easy because I experienced every step of my transition and my pronoun changes live in the media. It was not easy to assert myself. At the beginning, I didn't dare to tell the journalists to gender me correctly. I was really not sure of myself. Today, I have more and more confidence every day in myself. And when I arrive in front of journalists, I first ask them if my press officer has given them my pronouns and if they have understood who I am. I think it's important to talk about it. It's important to make all trans-identified people visible, because there is not only one way to be transgender. There is not only one way to be non-binary. Magazines and social networks tend to create a new box, a model for being non-binary. They show slim, androgynous bodies, as if all non-binary or transgender people look like that. But being non-binary is breaking out of the box. And I will talk about my experience. I had a maximum breast reduction and not a torsoplasty. And only very little is said about this operation, so that when I came home from hospital, I wondered if I had made a mistake, because I can't find any public figures who look like me. I can't find any models. As far as hormones are concerned, I take testosterone in microdoses, and this is also an option that is not often talked about. I'm not saying I'm a role model. I'm just talking about my personal experience to say that it exists and that there are many ways to get there. In Belgium, at the moment, there are new advances. The pronoun in French, we say il, and it's the your, they pronoun. As this il pronoun has entered the dictionary 2 weeks ago, and this week the government announced that they will remove the gender on the identity cards. As a non-binary person, I'm delighted by this change. It's only a start, as gender is still readable via the national register number. But I also know that it's a problem for transgender men and transgender women, because sometimes they would like to rely on the gender of the identity cards to prove who they are now and not their birth gender. I hope everything is comprehensible with my words. Yeah. In Belgium, we are lucky to be able to talk about it, to gradually make trans identity visible, but few things are really put in place in public spaces or institutions for us. We live in a society that remains very binary and heteronormative. Even among feminists, transphobia can be found. Last Sunday, at the demonstration against gender-based violence, there was a group of TERFs who insulted and exposed transgender people who were there. Then they exposed them on social networks all the weeks after. At this moment, a lot of collectives are denouncing them because if you exclude transgender and non-binary people, no, you're not a feminist. I'm an artivist. I'm an artist, and I try to make sense of my art. I'm not the most knowledgeable person in the world, but I'm trying to make a difference in my own way. And when you are an artist in music, you have a spotlight on you, and it's important to use it to serve important causes. We have to make sense. I'm not perfect, but I do my best. And yeah, if you want to discover, I will put a link directly to my music if you want, and a video clip I recently made about the difficulty to be transgender, to be non-binary in that society. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very clear. Okay. So thank you for saying all those things. And yes, there's the link in the chat now. Very interesting. What you were just saying there, I think it just immediately brought to mind a quotation which I use in my research from Hannah Arendt in 1958 when she wrote The Human Condition. And it says this: plurality is the condition of human action because we are all the same, that is human, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who ever lived, lives or will live. What you were saying just totally reminded me of that right now. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Claudia Moroney is a non-binary photographer and activist based in Rome. Their political activism started in London, where Claudia lived for many years, fighting against austerity and more specifically against cuts to domestic violence services as a member of the trans feminist collective Sisters Uncut. Since getting back to their hometown in Italy, Claudia has been involved in two different collectives, Cagne Sciolte, which means Unleashed Bitches, a trans feminist collective which squatted in a former strip club in Rome and fights for queer rights, against heteropatriarchy and against domestic violence, with special attention on same-sex partnerships. And Guerrilla Transpoetica, Transpoetic Guerrilla, a trans and non-binary separatist collective fighting for trans rights in Italy, which aims to depathologize trans identities and to achieve the application of an informed consent model for gender-affirming medical care for trans people. Their pronouns are they, them. So over to you.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't unmute myself, so hi everyone. Apologies for my accent. I know it's a very thick Italian accent. I haven't prepared so much because I was only invited yesterday to this event, so apologies for not maybe having a complete picture. I just wanted to talk a bit about the situation in Italy and trans activism here, and yes, you must be aware of what has recently happened with the DDL ZAN, which was anti-hate speech law proposal, which not only didn't pass, but the people in parliament actually cheered when the law didn't pass, and it was a very appalling scene that has been so the video of this event has gone all around Europe. I was in Berlin at the time, and when I would say that I was Italian, people were like, "Oh, Italian! I just saw a video like your members of parliament cheering for discriminating like trans LGBT people and people with disability. So you know, for you." But it's not all doom and gloom. We are also trying to fight this very strong right-wing attempts to erase us. My experience has been a little bit difficult because I've been living in the UK for many years, and I was able to use a gender neutral pronoun, they, them, in English. We don't have such a thing in Italian. We're still trying to figure out how to like transform the language so it's not as binary. It's incredibly binary. And there is also, for when we speak about in plural, there is the universal masculine. So it's a very patriarchal binary language. Yeah, anyway. Sorry, just trying to think what I want to say. So well, since coming back, I struggled a bit to find people who I shared kind of like a political understanding with, because my experience in London, which is interesting to see people complaining so much about the situation in the UK, because I understand it's not great at the moment. But here is so much worse that in comparison, it seems almost like things are really great in the UK. I know it's not, and I encountered TERFs when I was in the UK as well. But here, culturally, people sometimes don't even know trans people exist, and the media is completely skewed against trans people. So with the collective, the trans separatist collective I'm part of, like the first thing that we actually, first action we did, because we are an anarchist collective, so we use direct action, was to protest against an article which was written on a major newspaper, which is supposed to be left-wing, La Repubblica, in Italy, and it was called Journey into Gender. And it was just a bunch of transphobic stuff about how now there's a race in numbers of like young trans people because there is like this trend of being trans, and in Italy there is like this big rhetoric about the children, like let's save the children. So there is this idea that, you know, trans people, we kind of co-opt and influence children so that they don't know anymore who they are and their identities are, you know, in danger, and the traditional family is in danger. There's also this big rhetoric about traditional family. So yeah, so this article was obviously written by a cis person who spoke mainly with gender critical feminists to research about gender, so yeah, so we did an action for that, like against that, and in general we're trying to tell the media that maybe if to speak about trans issues, they should employ trans people to do so, which should be basic, but apparently is like science fiction in Italy. And also we're trying to change the law here, which is not easy, especially working on a grassroots level, because another issues we have here, unfortunately, is the trans movement is very divided, which to me is absurd, but there is like power struggles between different trans associations and collectives, which to me is silly, because if we're already like a minority, if we start like fighting against each other, we're not going to achieve anything. But you know, unfortunately, I'm not the one deciding. And so ideally, we would like to change the law so that instead of needing a diagnosis, we would use the informed consent model to access gender affirming care, like medical care. Part of my collective is like also people who decided not to start a medical transition, which is also valid, obviously, and it's important also to be able to recognize that to be trans doesn't necessarily mean that you need to take any medical steps. And so another thing which ideally would be great to get eventually is the ability to self-ID and not to be diagnosed by someone as a trans person, to be able to change your name, for example, or your gender markers and stuff like that. Because one thing I envy my UK trans comrades when I was in the UK is that you can change your name just by deed poll, which is super easy, while in Italy that's not the case. Even to change your name, you need to go to you have to have an authorization by the judge. So it's a very complicated process, and there's a really high level of gatekeeping on each steps, from the, like, let's say admin steps, so like, you know, changing your name, gender markers, to the medical steps of accessing gender affirming care. So on the 12th of December, we're organizing what we're calling the general states, where different trans collectives around Italy are going to meet to try to decide like a strategy. So
one more minute now, please, Claudia.
Yeah.
One more minute.
1 more minute. Oh, sorry, I thought that was it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we're trying to organize something. Hopefully, is gonna be good. And I was really interested in reading also like strategies from other countries, and so potentially keep in touch, maybe do something together. And on local level, there are different collectives. One in Turin, especially, with putting pressure on the hospitals where trans people access medical care, because we have a very extensive waiting list, which are like 2 years to get a first appointment, which is insane. So there are lots of stuff going on, and that's the situation in Italy. Very rambly, but yeah, sorry, I didn't prepare myself.
Okay, thank you very much for that and for coming in at such short notice. That was very interesting, and interesting to hear that there's different problems in different countries, including Italy. One of the first manifestations of the term gender ideology, which is used by the far right, was actually used when the far right in Italy closed down an academic conference in the University of Verona, held by Professor Lorenzo Bernini. They opposed it and got it completely closed down. And this was the far right, not trans people or anything like that, the far right shutting things down. And that was the first time I've heard the far right using the term gender ideology, and that's the term that was borrowed by the gender criticals. Okay, do we have any questions? Now, we've got a few minutes, I think, for some questions to any of the panelists. Yeah, raise hands or place an asterisk. Anyone? Alina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your contributions. This really was very useful, if not the easiest listening, I think, for people here. And I totally want to echo what Tamsin said in the beginning. It must feel quite daunting to have to explain your experiences to a largely cis audience. So I really applaud you for taking the time to speak to us. My question was going to be just very brief and very practical, and it's basically, feel free to plug anything that you want our support for. Put links, put campaigns, put statements, anything that you think people need to know more about, whether it's here in the UK or indeed in Italy or anywhere, because you have to, we have to be useful to you. We have to learn to be useful to you beyond just sharing platforms, I think. Thank you so much again.
Anybody want to respond to that? I would just like to say, actually, there is a big protest being organised outside the BBC broadcasting house near Oxford Circus on the 8th of January, I think it's about 1 o'clock, to protest against their, not just the transphobic output of the BBC, but against the fact that the BBC decided to export this really horribly monstering transphobic article to Brazil. It was translated into Brazilian Portuguese and promoted to Brazilian outlets and on their Brazilian Twitter feed, apparently. Now, Brazil is the country in the world which has the largest number of transphobic murders. A third of all recorded murders of trans people are in Brazil regularly every year. I think there are 150 approximately. I was so angry about this, I organised for Transgender Day of Remembrance, I organised a protest outside the BBC, outside Broadcasting House, which was not reported on by anybody pretty much, but we had, we read the names for Transgender Day of Remembrance on the 20th of November as a protest against the BBC doing this. This is absolutely the BBC trying to kill trans people. And I emphasize trying to kill. That's what the BBC is doing at the moment. This is why I don't pay my TV license anymore. I don't have a TV. Tamsin.
I'll just add to that, Natasha, thank you. I mean, everyone should follow Natasha on Twitter and go to the protest that she's organising. Something for me that I found, and I don't know why this is, I don't know whether it's because trans people have asked for it or not, but it does feel as though those protests are mainly made up of trans people, and that allies don't come out and support in person as much as, you know, they do on social media. And then even on social media, it just doesn't feel like that cis people are holding the BBC, holding the Guardian, holding political parties, etc. to account. And in fact, that labour is kind of solely on the backs of trans people to do that. So I guess, you know, in your organisations, with the media that you read, like, use your voice and stand with us.
Yes, absolutely. Claudia.
I just wanted to say a couple of things I forgot. One thing, when you were mentioning the rates of trans people murders in Brazil, unfortunately in Italy we have the European record for transicides, and this year the TDAR was a lot more attended in the past. In the last one before the pandemic, it was 50 of us, which is in Rome is kind of a worrying, with 50 people come to Tidor. This year it was about 1,000, which is, you know, a big increase. But I completely feel what Tamsin was saying about cis people not really standing with us very often, because even in my feminist collective, some members of were uncomfortable about coming to Tidor, which to me is a strong sign that, you know, they could do better. And my intervention.
Yes, we actually, for Tidor this year, we did actually get quite a few cis people coming along to the one outside the BBC, which was very good. Tidor is, and other demos are actually a good place to hear what trans people have to say, because you don't hear us in the media. We are systematically excluded from the media. I mean, I noted that all this kerfuffle with Professor Stock from Sussex University, she was engaged, she had something like 50 media appearances straight after resigning from Sussex University. Now, I would be hard put to find 50 media appearances or articles by trans people in the last 3 years. I think it would be very, very difficult to find that. And she's one person. So I think it's very important to come and listen to trans people and to campaign for us to be heard. That's really what I'm campaigning against now in the media, is not campaigning against, but campaigning for trans people to be heard. In The Guardian, on the BBC, in all the other media. There are very few media, Independent and the Metro are probably the only ones in the mainstream that actually platform us. Anybody, we've got about a minute left. Does anybody have anything else to ask? Okay, I think that's probably everybody's ready for a break now, aren't we? So I think I better hand back to Seema. Thank you for allowing us to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. That was such a brilliant session, and I really want to hear more. We're definitely going to organise more events and hopefully some more campaigning as well on this issue.